Florida nights carry a certain weight, a specific density that is unique to the peninsula. It's not just the humidity, which is a physical presence, a damp blanket that clings to the skin from the first step outside. It's the atmosphere of latent possibility, a simmering pot of the beautiful and the grotesque. The air smells of salt, of blooming jasmine undercut by the faint, sweet rot of mangrove swamps, of car exhaust and grilled meat. For some, this weight is suffocating, a reminder of the slow, relentless decay of all things. For others, like Jason, it was an intoxicant. It was the feeling of being alive in a place where the rules of the rest of America seemed to have been left at the state line. Bleached and forgotten in the sun, Jason was a transplant, like so many. He'd arrived from Ohio 5 years ago, chasing the promise of a tech startup in Tampa that had, predictably, fizzled out within 18 months. Instead of going back to the Midwest with his tail between his legs, he'd clung to the state, finding a nondescript job as a CRM administrator for a medical supply company. It was a job that paid the rent on his one-bedroom apartment in a beige complex off the Dale Mabry Highway, a job that involved spreadsheets and muted conference calls and the slow, soul-crushing erosion of ambition. His life had become a series of muted tones. Beige walls, gray cubicle, the blue glow of his monitors. His friendships, mostly with other transplants, were maintained through group texts and occasional happy hours that always ended with the same complaints about rent and traffic. He was 34, suspended in the quiet panic of a life that had not so much gone wrong as it had failed to launch in any meaningful direction. He felt like a ghost in his own life, a spectator. And so, he sought sensation. Not the big, life-altering kind, he was too risk-averse for that, but the small, sharp jolts that made him feel, for a few hours, like he was more than just a collection of routines. Sometimes it was riding his motorcycle too fast over the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, the Gulf wind tearing at his clothes. Other times it was a line of cocaine in a noisy Ybor City bathroom, the chemical buzz making the world temporarily vivid and interesting. Most often, though, it was this, the deliberate, calculated pursuit of a stranger. It was a game. The swiping, the matching, the coded banter, the meeting. It was a transaction, but one where the currency was validation. For a night, he wasn't Jason the CRM admin, he was an adventurer, a conqueror. Tonight, the need was particularly acute. It was a Friday, and the week had been a special kind of hell, a system migration that had gone sideways, leaving him to field angry calls from sales reps all afternoon. The loneliness in his apartment felt heavier than the humid air outside. He needed an escape. A hard reset. The bar was called the Sand Dollar, a place chosen for its deliberate anonymity. It was a dark, narrow cave tucked between a laundromat and a vacated storefront, its windows tinted so dark they were black. Inside, the air was a cocktail of stale beer, disinfectant, and the 100 different perfumes and colognes of its patrons. A ceiling fan turned with a lazy, rhythmic click, doing a little more than stirring the thick air. The lighting was low, forgiving, painting everyone in shades of amber and shadow. He saw her almost immediately. She wasn't just sitting at the bar, she was holding court at the end of it, a queen on a throne of worn red vinyl. She was a large woman, there was no denying it. She must have been pushing 350, maybe 400 pounds, but it was distributed with a kind of powerful authority. She wasn't soft, she was substantial. She wore a tight, black tank top that showed off thick, strong arms covered in a tapestry of tattoos, a mermaid, a serpent, an intricate geometric pattern that disappeared under the sleeve. Her hair was a shock of vibrant crimson, piled messily on her head with a few stray curls clinging to her damp neck. What captivated Jason wasn't just her size, but her utter command of the space around her. While other people chatted nervously or stared into their phones, she was perfectly still, sipping a dark rum and coke, her eyes scanning the room with an expression of mild, amused boredom. She caught him looking. Instead of glancing away, she held his gaze, a faint, challenging smile playing on her lips. It was a dare. He felt a thrill, a jolt of the exact sensation he was chasing. This was not the safe, curated kind of woman he usually matched with online. This was something else entirely. Raw, unapologetic, dangerous. He bought 2 shots of cheap tequila, liquid courage, and carried them over, the sticky floor tugging at his shoes. "Looks like you could use one of these," he said, his voice sounding too loud in his own ears. Her eyes, a startlingly light hazel, flicked from his face to the shots and back again. "That depends," she said, her voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in his chest. "You gonna be a pain in my ass? Hopefully not," Jason said, managing a grin that felt less forced than he expected. She laughed, a short, sharp bark, and took one of the shots. "Chloe," she said, knocking it back without a flinch. "Jason." The conversation that followed was a dance of clichés and innuendo, but to Jason, it felt profound. Chloe was sharp and brutally honest. She mocked his job, his shoes, the way he held his beer. It wasn't cruel, it was refreshing. She was a stone skipping across the surface of life, and she seemed to find the depth everyone else struggled with to be tedious. She was from Florida, a native, and she spoke of the state with the proprietary cynicism of someone who had seen all its cycles of boom and bust, beauty and decay. "Everyone comes here to be someone else," she said, swirling the ice in her glass. "They think the sun will bleach their past. All it does is show the cracks more clearly." Jason was mesmerized. This was real. This was the antithesis of his Bay existence. When she leaned in close, her scent, a mix of sweat, perfume, and the faint, metallic tang of the bar, filled his senses. It was pungent animal. "Your place or mine?" she asked, her tone leaving no room for ambiguity. The game was over. The transaction was proposed. "Yours," Jason said, the tequila and the desire making the decision for him. He wanted to step into her world, however temporary it might be. Her world was a third-floor walk-up in a stucco apartment building that had once been pink but was now a streaked, sun-bleached salmon color. The hallway smelled of mildew and fried food. Inside, her apartment was a landscape of controlled chaos. Clothes were piled on a single armchair, books and magazines formed precarious towers on the floor, and the small kitchenette was crowded with dirty dishes. The air was thick, warm, and carried a complex aroma, incense trying and failing to mask the scent of old cooking oil, cigarettes, and something else, something musky and organic. Jason's initial surge of lust was tempered by a flicker of unease, but he dismissed it. This was part of the adventure. This was real. This was the opposite of his sterile, lonely apartment. There was no preamble. The encounter was as direct as their conversation had been. It was frantic, clumsy, a collision of bodies in the dim light filtering through the blinds from a street lamp outside. It was in this frantic, heated moment, as he was lost in the sensation, that the pain came. It was not the mild discomfort of a scrape or a bruise. It was a sudden, precise, and excruciating stab, as if a red-hot needle had been driven deep into the root of his penis. He cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound, and jerked back. Chloe froze for a second, then let out a low chuckle. "What's the matter, tough guy? Can't handle it, something? Something bit me, or cut me," he gasped, his body curled protectively. She reached over and clicked on a cheap ceramic lamp on the bedside table. The sudden light was harsh, revealing the sweat-sheened reality of the room, the stained sheets, the dust motes dancing in the air. "Let me see," she said, her tone shifting from amusement to mild irritation. She peered down. "It's nothing. A little friction burn." You're just too sensitive. She prodded the area with a finger, and a fresh wave of pain made him flinch. See? Nothing. You got soft skin. Relax. Shame, hot and immediate, washed over him. A friction burn. Of course. He was being a child. A wimp. This was a woman who demanded intensity, and he was whimpering over a little scrape. The pain was still there. A bright, hot point of agony, but he pushed it down, buried it under layers of embarrassment and a desperate need to prove himself. He forced a smile. Sorry. You're right. Just surprised me. He re-engaged, but the magic was broken. The pleasure was now a distant memory, overshadowed by the persistent, throbbing pain. He was just going through the motions, his mind focused not on the woman beneath him, but on the fire spreading from his groin. He finished quickly, a relief only in the sense that it meant he could stop. Afterward they lay in silence. Jason felt a profound sense of emptiness. The validation he'd sought had curdled into something sour. The room, which had seemed excitingly chaotic an hour ago, now felt squalid and oppressive. The smell was making him nauseous. He needed to leave, uttered, swinging his legs off the bed and starting to dress. His movements were stiff, careful. Chloe didn't object. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. Suit yourself? The drive home was a special kind of torture. Every minor bump in the road sent a jolt of pain radiating through his pelvis. The initial sharp sting had been replaced by a deep, ominous throbbing, a pulse of heat that seemed to be growing with every beat of his heart. He tried to adjust his position, but there was no relief. By the time he pulled into his parking space, he was sweating, despite the blasting AC. A fever was setting in. He stumbled into his apartment, the familiar beige walls offering no comfort. He went straight to the bathroom, his heart hammering a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely undo his belt. A cold dread, far colder than any fever chill, was seeping into his bones. He finally managed to get his pants down and looked in the mirror over the sink. The breath caught in his throat, becoming a strangled gasp. The small, red mark he'd seen in Chloe's dim apartment was gone. In its place was a horror show. The skin of his groin and upper inner thigh was a swollen, grotesque landscape of lurid purple and black. It was mottled like rotting fruit. The flesh was hot to the touch and impossibly tight, stretched shiny and taut over the swelling. Thin, dark red lines, lymphangitis, though he didn't know the term, were beginning to creep out from the epicenter, tracing paths up towards his abdomen like malevolent rivers on a map. And the smell. A sickly sweet, putrid odor, the unmistakable scent of necrotizing tissue, filled the small, humid room. This was not a friction burn. This was not an infection. This was something predatory. It was as if a creature was inside him, devouring him from the inside out, and he could watch its progress in real time. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized him. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slipping on the screen. He called 911. His voice was a high-pitched, frantic thing he barely recognized. Something's wrong with me. My skin. It's turning black. It's spreading. I think I'm dying. The ambulance ride was a blur of lights and sirens and concerned faces. The triage nurse at St. Joseph's Hospital took one look at him, her professionally calm demeanor cracking for a fraction of a second. And he was rushed past the waiting room full of coughing children and people with sprained ankles. He was a Category 1 emergency. In the curtained bay, doctors and nurses swarmed around him. Questions were fired at him. What happened? When did it start? Any recent injuries? Allergies? He answered in monosyllabic grunts, the fever making the world swim. He couldn't bring himself to tell the whole truth. A cut, he mumbled, During sex last night. The diagnosis came with terrifying speed. A senior surgeon, a man with a grim, tired face, came to his bedside. "Mr. Jason, you have a very serious condition called necrotizing fasciitis," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's a bacterial infection that attacks the soft tissue. It's sometimes called the flesh-eating bacteria." Jason finished, the words a ghost on his lips. He'd seen the headlines. The Florida man stories. It was always something that happened to other people, to fishermen who got nicked by a bait knife, to hurricane survivors wading in contaminated water. Not to a CRM admin from Ohio after a one-night stand. "Exactly," the surgeon said. "It's a surgical emergency. The bacteria are spreading through the facial plane, the connective tissue under your skin, and cutting off blood supply. The tissue is dying. We have to go in now and debride, which means cut away all the infected and dead tissue, to stop it. We have to be aggressive. Do you understand?" Jason could only nod, tears of terror and pain streaming down the sides of his face into his ears. He was signed a stack of consent forms, his signature a shaky scrawl. They mentioned the possibilities: colostomy, urinary diversion, amputation of the genitals, amputation of limbs. The goal was to save his life, everything else was secondary. The world dissolved into the bright, cold sterility of the operating room. The mask came over his face, and he welcomed the oblivion. He awoke to a different kind of pain. A vast, overwhelming, profound pain that seemed to emanate from a void at the core of his being. He was in the ICU. Tubes were everywhere, in his nose, in his arms, in his throat. A ventilator hissed rhythmically. The first thing he was truly aware of, beyond the pain, was the weight of the blankets on his legs. Or, rather, the lack of weight in one specific, central area. He tried to move his hand, but it was tethered by N4. A nurse, a kind-faced woman with gentle hands, saw he was awake. "Jason, you're in the hospital. You've had surgery. You're okay. You're safe." He tried to speak, but the tube in his throat made it impossible. His eyes, wide with panic, darted down towards his groin. The nurse followed his gaze. Her expression was a masterpiece of professional compassion, but he saw the truth in her eyes. The surgeons had to remove a significant amount of tissue. She said carefully, "You have a wound vac in place to help with healing. The most important thing is that the infection is stopped. You're going to be with us for a while." While turned out to be 6 weeks. The first surgery was just the beginning. He underwent a second, and then a third debridement, as the surgeons, like meticulous gardeners pruning a blighted plant, cut away every last trace of the infection. They took his testicles. They took most of his penis. They took large swathes of skin and fat and muscle from his lower abdomen and inner thighs. He was left with a cratered, horrifying landscape, a testament to the bacteria's voracious appetite. The daily wound care was a ritual of torture. The nurses would come, their cheerfulness a cruel contrast to what was about to happen. They would remove the vacuum dressing, and the air would hit the raw, exposed tissue, sending waves of agony so intense he would vomit. They would irrigate the cavernous wound, picking away any tiny bits of non-viable tissue. He would scream. He would beg. He learned the true meaning of the word. Helpless. His parents flew down from Ohio. Their faces, when they first saw him, were a mosaic of shock, horror, and grief that would haunt him forever. He told them the sanitized version, the one he would cling to for the rest of his life. A cut from a broken zipper had gotten infected. It was a freak, terrible accident. The shame of the truth, the sordidness of the bar, the squalor of Chloe's apartment, his own reckless pursuit of sensation, was a burden too heavy to share. It was his secret, his personal hell, layered on top of the medical one. The infection was beaten, but the battle was far from over. He had to learn to live with a colostomy bag, a plastic pouch adhered to his stomach that collected his waste. He had to learn to catheterize himself through what little remained of his urethra. The psychological toll was immeasurable. He was no longer a man. He was a collection of medical apparatuses, a monster. He fell into a deep, clinical depression. The hospital psychiatrist prescribed antidepressants and talked about adjustment disorder. But the words felt meaningless. How does one adjust to having the core of one's identity carved away? When he was finally discharged, he was a ghost returning to a haunted house. His beige apartment was a prison. He couldn't look at himself in the mirror. The sight of his own body, now a roadmap of scars and grafts, filled him with self-loathing. He stopped going out. He stopped answering calls from his few friends, who eventually stopped calling. He lost his job. The world of spreadsheets and conference calls belonged to a different Jason, a man who no longer existed. His life became a cycle of pain management, wound care, and therapy sessions that felt futile. He was plagued by nightmares. Not of the bacteria, but of Chloe. In the dreams, she was always laughing, and her laughter wasn't malicious, but pitying. It was the sound of someone who knew the fundamental fragility of men like him, who knew that the pursuit of sensation would inevitably lead to a pain far greater than the pleasure it promised. One day, months into his convalescence, driven by a morbid, masochistic curiosity, he tried to find her. He went back to the Sand Dollar. The bartender, a new guy, didn't know a Chloe. He drove past her apartment building. There was a "for rent" sign staked in the patchy lawn. She was gone, vanished back into the Florida landscape from which she emerged. She was a force of nature. A hurricane that had touched down in his life, left utter devastation in her wake, and moved on. He never pressed charges. What would be the point? The encounter was consensual. The bacteria was a matter of fate, a microscopic lottery he had lost. There was no crime to report, only a profound, life-altering consequence. He was alone with his story, a living, breathing Florida man headline, but one with no punchline, only a permanent, aching silence where a life used to be. Sometimes, on the most humid of Florida nights, when the air feels like a weight he can't bear, he stands on his balcony and looks out at the glittering lights of the city. He can still feel the ghost of that night, the neon glow of the bar sign, the feel of the sticky floor, the rumble of Chloe's laugh. But the memory of desire is long gone, burned away by a far more powerful fire. What remains is the memory of the pain, the moment he ignored the warning, the instant a simple, reckless decision became a life sentence. The sun had indeed bleached his past, just as Chloe had said. But it hadn't erased it. It had only exposed the cracks, and into those cracks, a nightmare had bloomed, leaving him forever scarred, a permanent resident of the shadowy, grotesque side of the Florida equation.